You're listening to the Hour of the Time. I'm William Cooper. How's that for double programming, folks? You get the Hour of the Time lead-in music and Jesus Saves at the same time. I don't know how that happens, but who cares? They're both relevant. For those of you who wish to attend the shindig in Phoenix on December the 10th, call 1-800-REFOUND. R-E-F-O-U-N-D. 1-800-REFOUND. You can get all the information about that conference through that number. And make sure you do it in plenty of time to make plans. It's a pretty good lineup of people speaking, including me, yours truly, William Cooper, and a couple of others that you need to hear. One in particular, and I'll talk more about that on Monday when I come in with the complete set of press releases for the thing. I call it the thing because I don't know what else to call it. Anyway, call 1-800-REFOUND. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of you find it just absolutely incredible, some of the comments I've made about our supposed trip to the moon. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we didn't go to the moon. I don't know if we did or not. I suspect we've been going to the moon a long time before we said we went to the moon. Anyway, that's what the research that we do around here tells us. But we do know that what they tell us about the moon and the information that we glean from the releases on the scientific information by NASA just don't jive, folks. It doesn't click. It's not right. So something is a lie. What is it? What they tell us they found up there, or what science tells us, or what the mathematical formulas tell us? We do know that even though they may have gone to the moon, the television or televised events purported to be broadcast from the moon was not so. And we also know that many of the photographs that they have released purported to have been taken on the moon contain things that cannot possibly exist on the moon if what they tell us about the moon are correct, and if what they tell us about the optics in these satellites, for instance, Lunar Orbiter 4, that supposedly took these photographs. So tonight, I'm going to demonstrate to you that if I'm crazy, I'm not the only one that's crazy. And if you've got any sense about you, even half a brain, before you make any judgments on me or anyone else who has uncovered the same information, you'd better get out your pen and paper and your old mathematical textbooks and do some figuring for yourself. You should also get copies of the relevant NASA photographs, put them under high magnification, and check it out yourselves. Because if you don't, then in my estimation, you're just another dummy. And you should never believe it just because I say it or somebody else says it. Because if you do that, again, you're just another dummy. And if you can prove any of this wrong, I would certainly like to see that proof. Not your allegations, not your personal attacks, not your bullshit. I want to see your proof. Okay? So if you've got it, send it. We love information. We love proof. And as I've said many, many times in the past, I would love to be wrong about all of this stuff. I really would, folks. But unfortunately, so far, no one, and I mean no one, has been able to prove me wrong. You know, in August, I believe it was, when we had our convention here, I did about 6 hours of presenting nothing but proof, absolute, irrefutable proof, that what they told us about the space program cannot possibly be true. And everyone sitting in that audience believed that it all was true when we began that memorable presentation. And there were a couple of people there who really believed extraterrestrials were here, bonking people and zapping them and taking them up into their spacecraft and impregnating them and taking sperm and ova and doing all kinds of strange things and dumping them by the side of the road. And by the time that was finished, everyone in that room, and there were a lot of people here, folks, had a completely different viewpoint of the space program. And anyone who takes a legitimate, hard, scientific look at it, without believing anything, going in objectively, will come out with the same conclusions. May not agree on every point. Even scientists don't agree on all scientific points, and not everything constitutes absolute proof. But we will all agree upon one thing. We've been lied to about the space program. That there will be no doubt about whatsoever amongst anyone or any group of people who seriously study what we've been told and what science tells us and what we know to be fact. And so I've revealed these things on the radio also. Only I have never had 6 hours in a row, nor a visual medium to present the radio audience with the same proof that I presented here to the people who attended the conference. So tonight I will present over the radio information that you can check yourselves. And not too long ago, when we were discussing the same subject, someone called in and talked about a book called Moongate, and I said, yes, I knew the book. We have it. I didn't know where it was because we only have about 1/4 of our books on the library shelves, and it's a lot of books. And we've been receiving books and unpacking books ever since we opened this center. And I just recently came upon the book entitled Moongate, Suppressed Findings of the United States Space Program, the NASA Military Cover-Up by William L. Bryan II. So tonight's broadcast will be based upon this book. The majority of the program I will read verbatim from this book, interjecting, as I always do, my own knowledge and what we've picked up from research through the Intelligence Service and the Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence. We will not take calls on the air tonight, so don't bother wearing your fingers to a stub dialing. We will not answer the phone. According to conventional science, the moon, ladies and gentlemen, has only 1/6 of the Earth's surface gravity. Sir Isaac Newton formulated the law of universal gravitation in 1666. That's the year 1666, which of course led to this conclusion. And for many years we lived in a Newtonian universe. Well, a man came along named Albert Einstein and sort of fractured that universe. But we're not going to get into that. The famous law states that the gravitational pull of one body on another body depends on the product of the masses of the two bodies. Therefore, Earth, a planet, will attract another object with a certain specific force. This law also states that the gravitational force decreases as the distance away from this planet increases. The further out in space an object is from the Earth or Moon, the less pull or tug is exerted upon it. Now, Newton discovered that gravity decreases away from the surface of the Earth in the same way light intensity diminishes away from a light source. Only 1/4 as much light illuminates a given surface area 200 feet from a light source as compared to 100 feet. Similarly, at 300 feet, only 1/9 as much is received as compared to 100 feet. Now, this rapid drop-off follows the inverse square law. For the following discussion that I'm going to impart to you, the book has some figures in it. If you can find the book, I don't know if it's still in print or not, but I've given you the title and the author. So go look for it. But there are figures that illustrate what I'm going to be talking about. Near the Earth's surface, objects fall with an acceleration of 32.2 feet per second every second. Therefore, as each second goes by, an object will gain in speed by 32.2 feet per second. It will continue to accelerate until it reaches a constant speed because of air resistance, and this is the only limitation involved here. So if there were no atmosphere, this would not apply. In moving away from the Earth's surface, an observer will find that at an altitude of 3,960 miles, or 2 radii from the Earth's center, the gravitational pull has been reduced by a factor of 4, just as in the light example. At this altitude, bodies have only 1/4 of their surface weight. Therefore, a 200-pound man would weigh only 50 pounds. Furthermore, he would be accelerated at 1/4 the surface rate, or 8 feet per second, and it would take him twice as long to fall a given distance starting from a position at rest. Now, moving out to a distance of 3 Earth radii from the center, or 7,920 miles from the surface, the force of gravity decreases to 1/9 of the surface value. You see, the 200-pound man would now weigh only 22 pounds and would be falling 3.6 feet per second faster after every second of fall. At the distance of the moon, the force exerted by the Earth is only 1/3600th the value on the Earth's surface. Therefore, the moon should only be falling toward the Earth 32.2 divided by 3,600 feet per second. It would soon crash into the Earth if it were not slowly rotating about the Earth every 27 days or so. 28 days is a misnomer as far as the Earth's period of rotation, the moon's period of rotation about the Earth. It's really a little over 27 days. This orbit or rotation is what keeps it from falling. You see, the laws of physics say that a body in motion will tend to go directly in a straight line unless affected by some outside force, in this case gravity. Gravity is trying to make the moon fall toward the Earth, and the moon's motion forward is tending to make it go in a straight line. At a certain point, it reaches a balance and maintains an orbit. Now, man-made satellites orbit the Earth in exactly the same way the moon does. However, since they are usually much closer to the Earth than the moon, the Earth's pull is significantly stronger on them, and because of this, they must travel much faster to continue orbiting. The moon moves around the Earth at a speed of about 2,300 miles per hour, while a satellite only 100 miles above the Earth must travel nearly 17,500 miles per hour to maintain this balance. It's called an orbit. You see, an orbit is nothing more than a balance point between the speed of a mass forward in space attempting to keep it in a straight path against the force of gravity trying to make the body fall to the Earth. Newton's analysis of gravitation was devised from the observation of the orbiting moon and objects falling on the Earth. And until similar experiments are performed on planetary bodies like the moon, the exact values of their surface gravities can never be determined. Newton could not even determine the moon's mass or predict the moon's force of attraction on other objects. Its mass was later calculated to be about 1/82nd of the Earth's by observing how much the Earth moves around the common center of rotation of the Earth and moon. In turn, the moon's derived mass and the Earth's predicted mass were used to calculate the moon's surface gravity, which came out to be 1/6 of Earth's. Now, since the moon is a much smaller body than Earth, it did not seem unreasonable to scientists that it should have a correspondingly smaller surface gravity. The point where a space vehicle enters the predominant attractive zone of the moon's gravity is called the neutral point, and this will become very important. It is the region in space where the Earth's force of attraction equals the moon's force of attraction. In other words, again, a balance point. where an object placed between the two should neither fall toward the Earth nor toward the Moon. Since the Moon is smaller and supposedly has a smaller surface gravity, the neutral point should be quite close to the Moon. In fact, if it is assumed that the Moon has 1/6 of the Earth's surface gravity, the neutral point is calculated to be about 9/10 of the distance between the Earth and the Moon. The average distance to the Moon is about 239,000 miles. Hence, this places the neutral point approximately 23,900 miles from the Moon's center. Now, to show you that this neutral point distance has been predicted and calculated time and time again by astronomical scientists and engineers for many years, there are a series of references, and you can look them up. There's a book called Principles of Astronautics. It was written in 1965 by a fellow of the British Interplanetary Society, M. Vetricht. Gave the calculated neutral point value as follows. At a distance of 346,000 kilometers, or 215,000 miles from the Earth, and 38,000 kilometers, or 23,600 miles from the Moon, that is what is called the neutral point in. The attraction exerted by the Earth is equal to that exerted by the Moon. In a book called Exploration of the Moon, written in 1966 by an astronomer, Franklin M. Branley, the neutral point is listed as 20,000 miles from the Moon, or 220,000 miles from the Earth. In United States on the Moon, written by U.S. News and World Report, and this is for all you socialists because you think that that publication could never lie, the neutral point distance is again displayed as 22,000 miles from the surface of the Moon. Now remember, the original figures we gave were from the center of the Moon, so that's the basic discrepancy here. In the Mathematics of Space Exploration, written in 1965, Merle H. Arendt calculated the neutral point using Newton's gravitation law and the Moon's mass expressed as 1/83rd of the Earth's mass. His conclusion, assuming a Moon-to-Earth distance of 230,000 miles, was the neutral point is about 23,900 miles from the Moon at a point almost precisely 9/10 of the distance to the Moon. Still another derivation of 23,800 miles was made by John A. Eisel in 1967 in a book called Astrodynamics, Rockets, Satellites, and Space Travel, assuming the Moon's mean distance of 238,857 miles. He assumed a ratio of Earth to Moon masses of 81.56. Now, within the topic space travel, in the 1961 edition of Collier's Encyclopedia, the following is stated, quote, "There must come a point where the two poles are equally strong and where they balance each other. This point lies about 23,500 miles from the surface of the Moon." The 1960 printing of the Encyclopedia Britannica states the following within the topic, interplanetary exploration, and I quote, after a sip of coffee, "The so-called neutral point between Earth and Moon, this is a fictitious station on the Earth-Moon axis, about 19 moon radii from the Moon, beyond which the Moon's gravitational pull is stronger than the Earth's. 19 moon radii equals 20,520 miles from the Moon." So, it is probably evident to all of you that minor differences exist between these values. And this is due to slightly different assumptions of the Earth to Moon distance and ratio of Earth to Moon masses. An analysis, ladies and gentlemen, of how much this neutral point distance should vary depending on the Earth to Moon distance gives the results that I'm going to impart to you. And this assumes that the distances are measured from the Earth's center to the Moon's center. If the total distance center to center is 252,710 miles, then Earth to neutral point should be 227,517 miles. The Moon to neutral point should be 25,193 miles. If the center to center is 238,885 miles, then the Moon to neutral point should be 23,815 miles. If the total distance center to center is 221,463 miles, then the moon to neutral point should be 22,078 miles. So in any case, the range of neutral point distances to the moon's center will be between 22,078 miles and 25,193 miles, with the assumption that the moon has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. And since so many people and organizations have stated the neutral point distance within a very close range of each other with no major dramatic discrepancies, there seems to be no question as to where it is. Now, to satisfy the technically minded listener, the complete derivation of the neutral point distances that I have given you, you can find presented in Appendix A in the book Moongate. So, if you're interested in pursuing that, again, get this book. Now, I remind you that the neutral point distances were based upon Newton's law of universal gravitation. In addition, most of the writers who referenced them were probably unaware of space program findings regarding the neutral point's real location. As I mentioned previously, only by observing falling or orbiting bodies in the moon's vicinity could the actual neutral point distance, or the moon's true gravity, be determined. And this information could have been available to NASA or the Russians as early as 1959 from the very first moon probes. If moon probes successfully orbited and landed prior to 1969, the actual neutral point distance should have been available to the public also. If it were published, there would be an exact method of determining the moon's surface gravity. So the ramifications, ladies and gentlemen, of finding a neutral point distance greater than the 20,000 to 25,000 mile distances that I have given you can be considered. We showed you how gravity falls off with distance away from the Earth's surface. The moon displays the same behavior as the Earth. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the moon's gravitational pull, 1,080 miles above its surface, or 2 radii from the moon's center, would be 1/4 the surface value. Similarly, at 3 moon radii, or 2,160 miles above the surface, the force would be 1/9 the surface value. With this concept in mind, you should see that if the real neutral point distance from the moon's surface were considerably greater than 25,000 miles, the moon's surface gravity would have to be much greater, not just a little, but much greater than the predicted value of 1/6 of the Earth's surface gravity. It would imply that Newton's law of gravitation does not hold for bodies of planetary size. It would also imply that NASA and the military have been suppressing information on the true nature of moon gravity. So, clearly, the neutral point distance had to have been exactly determined if astronauts were to land safely on the moon. And this could only be determined experimentally, and a history of this discovery will be presented on this broadcast. A lunar probe, or spacecraft launched from the Earth, will continuously lose velocity until it reaches the neutral point due to the Earth's gravitational pull upon it, unless, of course, it has a constant source of acceleration. However, after it passes the neutral point, the moon's pull becomes stronger, and it begins to accelerate, increasing in velocity. It must have the proper trajectory to assume a lunar orbit or to score a direct hit upon the moon's surface. The need, ladies and gentlemen, for an accurate measurement of the moon's gravity, hence the precise neutral point distance, was pointed out by Hugh Odeshaw, Executive Director of the United States National Committee for the International Geophysical Year, and he presented a report in 1958, which I have, to all member nations of the International Geophysical Year, entitled Basic Objectives of a Continuing Program of Scientific Research in Outer Space. This came directly out of a symposium held for that entire year, which I've discussed in previous episodes of the Hour of the Time, to which we have the booklets that were printed and the reports that came out of that year-long colloquium. In this report, He indicated that estimates of the moon's mass at that time were based on observations of the motions of asteroids and the Earth's polar axis. The uncertainty attributed to the moon's mass was given as 0.3%, which was great enough to affect lunar rocket trajectories. Accordingly, Odishaw indicated the desirability of determining the moon's mass more precisely in early moon experiments. Now, this could be accomplished by tracking the rocket as it approached the moon and deriving the moon's pull at each point of the trajectory, hence the surface gravity. Now, by now, you probably realize how much difficulty NASA and the Russians would have had in sending successful moon probes, even if they knew the exact position of the neutral point. For if the neutral point, hence the moon's gravitational pull, deviated considerably from the predicted value derived from Newton's law of universal gravitation, a series of failures would be expected in attempts to send successful lunar probes. It's also reasonable, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude that a discovery of a significant difference in the expected moon gravity would require many more years of reprogramming, rocket design, lunar probe design, and so on, and so on. The time required for people to readjust their thinking patterns would also be a very significant factor, especially after nearly 300 years of education and training in the gravitational concepts of Sir Isaac Newton. So in the style of the Department of Defense, we should also expect that suppression of the new findings would and did occur. Now, keeping these ideas in mind, along with the conventional idea of the position of the neutral point from the moon, the history of lunar probes will now be reviewed. The moon was chosen as the first target for exploration simply because it's the closest celestial body to the Earth, therefore giving us an excellent chance for some successes. Russia was the first nation that we know of publicly to send a successful lunar probe called Luna 1 on January the 2nd, 1959. It flew within 4,660 miles of the surface and broadcast information back to Earth after traveling into space. The United States had made 3 unsuccessful attempts with Pioneers 1, 2, and 3 in 1958 before achieving a flyby 37,300 miles from the surface several months after Luna 1. Luna 2 was launched on September 12, 1959 and became the first lunar probe to hit the moon, sending back signals before impact. And we'll take a short break and resume. Don't go away, folks. I'll be right back. Luna 3 was launched October 4th, 1959, and circled behind the moon, approaching within 4,372 miles. It sent back pictures of the far side. Significantly, the Russian program for exploration of the moon came to a stop for 4 years following the Luna 3 lunar probe. All of the Luna shots were tracked with radar to collect trajectory and gravitational data. As previously mentioned, the trajectory of an object in the moon's vicinity enables the surface gravity to be calculated, which in turn enables the neutral point to be calculated. If the findings deviated from the expected ones, it would probably require years to reassess and re-engineer future moon probes. A soft landing would require a much larger launch vehicle and a great deal more fuel if the gravity were a lot higher than expected. Russia's secrecy concerning its space program is well known. Therefore, the United States may not have benefited from information obtained by Russian moon probes. According to Ralph Lapp, in a book entitled Man in Space, The Next Decade, and I quote, "The Soviets clamped tight secrecy over their rockets, never once releasing a photograph of a launching. Moreover, the Russian scientists were slow in making their data available to the scientific community," end quote. In addition, the United States Pioneer 4 flyby at 37,300 miles may not have been close enough to the moon to enable NASA engineers to determine the true nature of lunar gravity. At any rate, subsequent Ranger missions indicated that the United States was having many problems in achieving successful moonshots. The first Rangers carried seismometers in spherical containers designed to withstand the impact of landings. Unfortunately, Ranger 3, launched on January 26, 1962, missed its target completely and went into a solar orbit. Ranger 4 hit the moon on April 23rd, but did not send back any useful information, at least that the public is aware of. Ranger 5 was launched on October 18th and missed the moon by 450 miles. However, it was tracked for over 8 hours. Further launches were put off until 1964, and the entire program was reorganized, indicating that they had indeed located a different neutral point. It is significant that all Ranger missions after number 5 were designed only to take pictures because of the difficulty in achieving a semi-hard landing with the seismometer package. The seismometer was encased in a 30-inch balsa wood ball, which was to be slowed up sufficiently by retro rockets to hit the surface at 150 miles per hour and still survive. It was designed to be able to impact granite at 200 miles per hour and continue to operate. If the moon had only 1/6 of Earth's surface gravity, then perhaps the seismometer packages would have survived. However, if lunar gravity were much more than expected, a successful landing without big enough retro rockets for braking would be impossible. But even through the Apollo space program, they stuck to the 1/6 gravity figure. Evidently, the Ranger scientists anticipated that the weak 1/6 gravity would keep the velocity of impact down to a low enough level. Since they eliminated the package from further missions and delayed these missions for almost a year and a half, perhaps, just perhaps, they learned something new about the moon's gravity. After Russia's 4 years of silence, Lunar 4 was launched on April 2, 1963. It flew within 5,300 miles of the moon, and the purpose of this probe was never revealed except for a brief announcement that, and I quote, "Experiments and measurements which were conducted are completed. Radio communications with the spacecraft will continue for a few more days," end quote. Typical bureaucratese. It is probable that the need for detailed gravity data was behind the mission. Soft landings could not be successful without this kind of information. The United States launched Ranger 6 on January the 30th, 1964, and the electrical system was allegedly burned out when the cameras were accidentally turned on during the flight. Hence, no pictures were sent. Sound familiar? After supposedly redesigning the system to eliminate this danger, Ranger 7 was launched on July the 28th. It was successful and sent back thousands of pictures. Ranger 8 was launched on February 17, 1965, and Ranger 9 was launched on March 21, 1965. Both were successful, and some of the Ranger 9 pictures were broadcast on television. The Russians attempted a soft landing with Luna 5 on May 9, 1964, but it crashed at full speed. Luna 6 was launched on June 8th, but missed the moon, while Luna 7 crashed because the retro rockets supposedly fired too soon. Luna 8 was sent up on December the 3rd and also crashed. Luna 9 landed successfully on the moon on February the 3rd, 1966, or at least this is what we've been told. The United States soft landing program was called Surveyor and began in 1960. In 1962, a decision was made to trim the weight of Surveyor by more than 300 pounds, with many experiments abandoned. And what does that say? The reason given was problems with the proposed Atlas Centaur second stage. Surveyor's scheduled 1963 launch date passed, and it was not even close to being ready. The project costs were running 10 times the original estimates, and troubles forced one delay after another. A congressional inquiry was made, and the House Committee on Science and Astronautics found fault with the management practices of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, known as JPL, NASA, and the prime contractor, Hughes Aircraft. In a book entitled We Reach the Moon, John Noble Wilford gave an account of the surveyor's difficulties. It seems Jet Propulsion Lab officials conceded that they initially underestimated the difficulty of the project. Oh, me. One official admitted that the project was not given enough support in the earlier days and that they were overconfident in their ability to do things. It is probably more than coincidental that the Ranger 5 failure in October 18, 1962 resulted in the abandonment of the seismometer package and a significant delay in future Ranger missions due to the difficulty in a semi-hard landing. The Surveyor program, folks, was delayed for 28 months from its schedule, and Surveyor 1 did not soft land on the moon until June 2, 1966. The U.S. effort to orbit the moon using lunar probes began August 17, 1958, with Atlas Able 1. It missed the moon, as did the next two attempts. A decision was then made to build a larger spacecraft and to use the Atlas Agena D as the carrier. It appears, folks, that a larger rocket was necessary to carry a larger payload, which may have consisted of fuel used in braking the proposed orbiter. This would be necessary to reduce the velocity of the satellite so that it could achieve an orbit. Again, it seems much more than coincidental that the project to orbit the moon, which began in 1958, was postponed until 1964, when the Boeing company began work on the Lunar Orbiter project. The Russians managed to place Luna 10 into orbit around the moon on April 13, 1966, after having successfully soft-landed with Luna 9 on February 3, 1966. It appears that substantial retro-rocket braking was required for orbit insertion as well as soft landing. At any rate, both were accomplished a short time apart. The United States Lunar Orbiter 1 successfully went into lunar orbit on August 14, 1966. Lunar Orbiter 5 was sent crashing into the moon on January 31, 1968, after a successful mission. Now, these missions photographed over 99% of the moon and led to the discovery of lunar mascons, or increases in the moon's surface gravity in certain areas. These mascons we'll discuss at a later time. The U.S. Just checking, folks. Yeah. Because of the problems that we've had on satellite and we've had on getting hooked up and everything, it was important that we stop and check and make sure that we are, in fact, actually still up there. Now, we're not going to take any calls tonight, so whoever is calling, you're wasting your time. Absolutely wasting your time, because we're not going to answer the phone. And we're going to continue this on Monday, because if I get into too much detail tonight, in about 4 or 5 minutes, we're going to have to cut it. And when we do that, you're going to be left hanging. So I'm sort of going to wrap up what I was talking about real quick right now. And then we'll continue this on Monday night, and we'll continue it until you get an understanding of what I've been trying to tell you using scientific fact and not press releases from NASA or asking you to believe what I say on this radio broadcast just because I say it or because I tell you that we've discovered these things in our research. For those of you who come to our next conference here, if there are not too many who attended the first one, we will repeat. the special presentation on the space program, which will, I assure you, open your eyes like they've never been opened before. So far, tonight's analysis, folks, of the lunar probes indicates that the United States and Russia probably had a very clear picture of the nature of lunar gravity as early as 1959. And I believe, through my research, probably a lot earlier than that. However, it's a certainty that both countries learned how to work with lunar gravity and make soft landings by 1966. Now, this date is important in light of information on lunar gravity that I'm going to present to you on Monday night. Now, you've been kept in suspense concerning suggestions that moon gravity might deviate from the predicted value of 1/6 of Earth's. And this was necessary to provide the background information that you need to make a proper evaluation. The analysis on Monday night will focus on the position of the neutral point as given to the public by various writers and organizations subsequent to lunar probes. Ultimately, the source of the information is probably NASA. In reference to Apollo 11, Time magazine gave the following neutral point information in the July 25th, 1969 issue. Now listen to this, based upon what I've already told you. And make sure you're here Monday night, because you don't want to miss one single second of this. At a point 43,495 miles from the moon, lunar gravity exerted a force equal to the gravity of the Earth, then some 200,000 miles distant. End quote. You might be surprised, ladies and gentlemen, concerning this statement, since the neutral point distances presented earlier in this broadcast were all 20,000 to 25,000 miles from the moon. Now, you might think that time has made an error, but just to point out that the neutral point seems to have changed. On Monday night, we'll give you other sources that substantiate that claim. So, I hope you all have a continuing good and safe Thanksgiving weekend. So far, ladies and gentlemen, it is November the 25th, 1994. 22:55 Mountain Standard Time, and all is well. Good night, and God bless you all. Moongate, the suppressed findings of the United States space program, the NASA military cover-up. What you learned Friday was the tip of the iceberg, and for those of you who were curious and got out your calculators and began to do some figures beyond where we went based upon what you learned that night, you already know what I'm going to tell you tonight in the first part of this program. And then we're going to go into some other ones. Now, this broadcast is based upon my research, the research of the Intelligence Service, the Citizens Agency for Joint Intelligence, and a lot of it simply because you all think I'm nuts. A lot of it comes directly from a book entitled Moongate by William L. Bryan II. Find it if you can and read it. You need it for your own library, for NASA has lied to the world about the space program. Not only NASA, but the United States government, the military, everybody. As you will continue to discover by listening to the hour of the time, because nowhere else will you learn these things. Everywhere else, you get what they want you to know. And that's all you ever get. We left off reading a quote from an article in Time magazine, where they said at a point 43,495 miles from the moon, lunar gravity exerted a force equal to the gravity of the Earth, then some 200,000 miles distant. How can that be? You might be surprised. I was, concerning this statement, since the neutral point distances that we talked about last Friday night were all 20,000 to 25,000 miles from the moon. Now, it might seem that time has made an error. Therefore, we're going to look at some other sources to find out. Were they coming off the cuff, or were they telling us what they had been told? In the 1969 edition of History of Rocketry and Space Travel by Wernher von Braun and Frederick I. Ordway III, the following statement is made concerning Apollo 11. Quote, "The approach to the moon was so precise that the mid-course correction scheduled for 8:26 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on the 19th was canceled. At a distance of 43,495 miles from the moon, Apollo 11 passed the so-called neutral point, beyond which the lunar gravitational field dominated that of Earth. Consequently, the spacecraft, which had been gradually losing speed on its long coast away from Earth, now began to accelerate." End quote. There is no better source than Wernher von Braun. Note that the precision of the flight was so great that the mid-course correction was not needed. In actuality, they had planned it right down to the exact mile at the exact moment in space. In addition, the neutral point distance is given to the nearest mile in degrees exactly with the value given by Time magazine, which means Time magazine's source was NASA itself, and it had to come from the highest levels. Another reputable source is the Encyclopedia Britannica. This organization generally publishes information which is accepted by orthodox scientists, and therefore their claim for the neutral point distance should be in close agreement with Wernher von Braun. In reference to Apollo 11, the Britannica stated the following in the 1973 printing within the topic Space Exploration, and I quote, "Consideration of the actual dynamics of the Apollo trajectory will review the statements made above. The Apollo 11 spacecraft had been in Earth orbit at 118.5 miles altitude, traveling at 17,427 miles per hour. By firing the rocket motor at the exact moment when the spacecraft was precisely aligned along the proper trajectory, the velocity was increased to 24,200 miles per hour. Because the Earth's gravitational pull continued to act upon the spacecraft during its 2 3/4 day, or 64-hour journey toward the moon, the spacecraft velocity with respect to the Earth dwindled to 2,040 miles per hour at a distance of 39,000 miles from the moon. At this point, lunar gravitational attraction became greater than the Earth's, and the spacecraft commenced accelerating as it swung toward and around the far side of the moon, reaching a speed of 5,225 miles per hour. By firing the spacecraft rocket propulsion system, the velocity was reduced to 3,680 miles per hour, and the spacecraft entered an elliptical orbit about the moon." End quote. Now here, the distance is 39,000 miles, which is still close to the values given by Time magazine and von Braun. The reader may recall that in Chapter 2, reference was made to the 1960 printing of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which listed the neutral point distance as 19 moon radii, or 20,520 miles from the moon. So in this case, ladies and gentlemen, the distance discrepancy is between different printings of the same source. In a book entitled "We Reached the Moon," Wilford indicated that the spacecraft entered the lunar sphere of gravitational influence at about 38,900 miles from the moon. In Footprints on the Moon, written in 1969 by the writers and editors of the Associated Press, the neutral point is described as follows, quote, "Friday, day 3 of the mission, found Apollo 11 at the apex of that long gravitational hill between Earth and the moon. At 1:12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the nose-to-nose spaceships passed the milestone where the moon's gravity becomes the more important influence. The astronauts were 214,000 miles from the Earth, only 38,000 miles from their rendezvous with the moon, leading their target like a hunter leads a duck, end quote. Now, you might already recognize the obvious inconsistencies between the quoted figures, which vary between 38,000 and 43,495 miles. Still, ladies and gentlemen, even with that discrepancy, they are all much greater than the earlier quoted 20,000 to 25,000 miles. Many different values are given with varying degrees of precision, yet they still lie within a range which is radically different from pre-Apollo calculations, and there is no way to get around the discrepancy between the conventional pre-Apollo distances of 20,000 to 25,000 miles and the post-Apollo range of 38,000 to 43,495 miles. Even though the Earth-to-Moon distance varies between 200 varies between 221,463 miles and 252,710 miles, and spacecraft do not travel on a straight line between the Earth and Moon. This still does not explain the neutral point distance discrepancy. You see, the logical conclusion is that the latest neutral point information reached the general public at about the time of the first Apollo lunar landing in 1969, even though it was determined as far back as 1959 from early lunar probes. Clearly, ladies and gentlemen, this discrepancy has not been pointed out to the public until now. To this day, the status quo of science and government alludes to the 1/6 gravity of the lunar surface, which cannot possibly be with these new figures, unless it is representative of a neutral point less than 25,193 miles from the Moon, which, according to NASA, it is not. Therefore, the neutral point discrepancy and its implications must be placed under a microscope. And that's exactly what we're doing. You see, the Moon's surface gravity was calculated with the new figures presented above using the standard inverse square law technique. Since the radii of the Earth and Moon, the neutral point distance, and the Earth's surface gravity are known, the Moon's surface gravity is easily determined. And some of you have already done it, I know, because you've sent me faxes. The technique does not require a knowledge of the Moon's mass or the Earth's mass as Newton's law of gravitation does. The only aspect of Newton's law of gravitation which seems to be valid, folks, at this time is the inverse square law nature of gravity. Therefore, since the Earth's pull equals the Moon's pull at the neutral point, the inverse square law enables the pull of gravity at the Moon's surface to be determined easily. The technical derivation is presented in the back of this book in Appendix B. For those of you who can get this book and look it up, it's all worked out. The result is that the Moon's surface gravity is 64% of the Earth's surface gravity, not the 1/6 or 16.7% value predicted by Newton's law of universal gravitation. Raise your eyebrows? Well, it should, because I've been telling you these things all along. When the reader stops to consider that the 43,495-mile figure represents the measured value of the neutral point distance supplied to us by official sources, in effect, Werner von Braun, and if he didn't know, nobody does, an annoying paradox then arises. Why would experts release this information and yet continue to tell us that the Moon's gravity is 1/6 Earth's, ignoring all the pre-Apollo references to the neutral point distance of less than 25,000 miles, yet using the figure of the Moon's gravity as if it were, ignoring the new figure, and all the while perpetrating the lie. Additional information to come, ladies and gentlemen, suggests that the Moon's gravity might even be higher than 64% of Earth's. In consideration of what appears to be a cover-up and the sensitivity of the neutral point distance to slight variations in lunar gravity, NASA could have easily given the public understated figures. But if the neutral point is 43,495 miles from the moon, the surface gravity is 64% of Earth's. Shifting the neutral point out 8,500 miles to around 52,000 miles from the moon has the same effect of increasing the moon's surface gravity to the very same value as Earth's. The discrepancies that you're going to learn as we continue in this hour of the time broadcast involve the orbital period of spaceships around the moon and velocities attained by spaceships reaching the moon from the neutral point. You see, the publicized period and velocity values are not supportive of a 43,495-mile neutral point distance from the moon. Instead, they support the old neutral point distances and the moon's weak 1/6 gravity. Therefore, official information is inconsistent and contradictory, indicating a serious cover-up. The question is why the real neutral point distance leaked out. Did some of the NASA people try to sabotage the cover-up and let us know that something is not right with the Emperor's new clothes? Writers who covered the Apollo missions, ladies and gentlemen, consistently reported that the spacecraft were traveling less than 6,000 miles per hour when they reached the moon. And this was after they had passed the neutral point, traveling slightly more than 2,000 miles per hour, according to statistics furnished by NASA. Now, we've not seen calculation by any of the writers which derived the velocity attained at the time the spacecraft reached the moon. But it's reasonable to assume that NASA directly or indirectly supplied the information. And when we go back and check the press releases and the technical data supplied by NASA, this becomes evident. A glaring inconsistency arises when the facts and figures are examined, and a great lie is exposed. To begin with, the 43,495-mile neutral point distance and 1/6 gravity are incompatible, as I have already explained. In Space Frontier, written in 1971, Wernher von Braun gave the velocities of Apollo 8 at the neutral point and when it reached the moon as 2,200 miles per hour and 5,700 miles per hour, respectively. In the same discussion, he mentioned that lunar gravity took over at a point 38,900 miles from the moon, where the craft began speeding up again. So in working out the mathematics of velocity and going from the neutral point to the moon, the only way the craft could reach the moon traveling less than 6,000 miles per hour would be if 1/6 gravity is again assumed. If 1/6 gravity is assumed, the neutral point is around 24,000 miles from the moon, not 38,900. But why would Wernher von Braun lie about this? Because if this is true, then certainly he did. The craft would continue to lose velocity in its coast from the Earth until it reached a point about 24,000 miles from the moon. But this is not what these figures von Braun referenced said. You see, either the greater neutral point distance is correct with its high lunar gravity ramifications, or the greater neutral point distance is wrong and 1/6 gravity exists on the moon. And why did Wernher von Braun, the premier space scientist of NASA, publish this conflicting information? Well, I'm going to give you the following in an effort to show the ramifications of a high lunar gravity on the velocity when reaching the moon. 1/6 lunar gravity would accelerate the craft to a velocity of somewhat less than 6,000 miles per hour, while a 64% lunar gravity would boost the final velocity considerably higher. The derivation of final velocity is given using the 64% lunar gravity required by the 43,495-mile neutral point distance. And this, folks, also assumes that the initial velocity at that point is the 2,200 miles per hour claimed. This yields a final velocity of over 10,000 miles per hour. The discrepancy between the velocity demanded by 43,495-mile neutral point, hence a high lunar gravity, and the claimed value of 5,700 miles per hour is over 4,000 miles per hour. And before we get into a discussion of orbital velocity, an argument has to be presented which clearly shows that the neutral point distance is in the vicinity of the 40,000-mile mark. You see, on the Apollo 8 flight, the spacecraft reached the neutral point, allegedly 38,900 miles from the moon, traveling 2,200 miles per hour, at 55 hours 39 minutes into the mission. At 68 hours 57 minutes, it had reached the moon, traveling less than 6,000 miles per hour. Therefore, the distance was covered in 13 hours 18 minutes. If the neutral point were really 24,000 miles from the moon, the ship's average velocity would have been about 2,441 miles per hour, and the trip would only have taken about 9 hours and 50 minutes. Again, the big lie is exposed clearly. The times given by NASA support the greater neutral point distance, hence the moon's high gravity. And a detailed analysis of flight times provides additional confirmation of the moon's high gravity. If the moon had but 1/6 of the Earth's surface gravity, the Apollo 8 spacecraft would have continued to lose velocity until it reached the 24,000-mile mark. At that point, it would have begun to accelerate, reaching a final velocity of about 5,540 miles per hour at the moon. If it were traveling 2,200 miles per hour, 38,900 miles from the moon, its time of flight would have been 16 hours 44 minutes with the assumption of 1/6 gravity. Now this represents a discrepancy of over 3 hours from the NASA reported time of 13 hours and 18 minutes. The only way to account for the shorter flight time claimed by NASA is to assign a higher average velocity and final velocity to the spacecraft. So, folks, with the assumption of a 64% lunar gravity, the flight time is calculated to be 13 hours 47 minutes, which is very close to the NASA claim of 13 hours and 18 minutes. This analysis definitely shows that the NASA-supplied information contradicts itself. The flight times and neutral point distances are indicative of a high lunar gravity. Yet NASA continues to publicize the weak 1/6 gravity condition on the moon. And with all those scientists, they know beyond any shadow of a doubt that they're telling the public of the world a blatant, pre-calculated lie. Ladies and gentlemen, if the moon had 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, a satellite or spacecraft orbiting the moon would have a very low orbital velocity. And this is simply because the orbital velocity offsets the pull of gravity. If the gravity pull is less, the velocity required to maintain orbit is less. In other words, the tendency to fall is reduced, so the satellite can continue to orbit with less speed. At 1/6 gravity, a satellite orbiting the moon at an altitude of 70 miles would only be traveling 3,655 miles per hour. However, with a lunar gravity 64% of Earth's, the orbital velocity at the same height would be 7,163 miles per hour, or nearly double the value claimed. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, within the subject entitled Space Exploration, Apollo 11 reached the moon traveling 5,225 miles per hour and had to reduce its velocity to 3,680 miles per hour to assume an elliptical orbit. With a 64% lunar gravity, the spaceship would drop like a rock with such a low velocity and would crash into the moon. And yet that's what the figures tell us that the moon gravity is. So it's evident that with a high lunar gravity, the braking maneuver of the Apollo crafts would only have to reduce the 10,000-mile plus per hour velocity to 7,163 miles per hour to assume orbit. This orbital velocity indicates that the craft would circle the moon every 60 minutes instead of one orbit every 2 hours. What's going on here? The knowledge of these orbital periods must have been known by the mission control people, because during a certain percentage of every orbit, communication with the orbiting command module, or CM as it was called, is cut off when the craft passes behind the moon. That is, if it ever did, if it ever even went. The communication blackout allegedly lasted for 50 minutes out of every 120-minute orbit. You see, everything conflicts. All of their figures do not jive with each other. The velocity and communication blackout time are derived based on the 70-mile high orbit. With a 64% gravity, the blackout time would only be 24 minutes. Now, if this situation occurred, fairly tight security measures must have been employed to suppress information from the public. As long as the only means to monitor the astronauts' activities were through mission control, only a relatively small number of people would actually be aware of the situation, unless someone with a brain sat down with a calculator and figured it out. The vast majority of NASA people could still be kept in the dark if they could only be convinced not to question the figures. If such were the case, the tightest security area would be mission control, and the information presented indicates this. You see, John Noble Wilford covered the Apollo missions for the New York Times. In a book entitled We Reached the Moon, he discussed the Apollo program in considerable detail, along with his experiences in working with NASA. The following information was derived from his book regarding the fire that killed Grissom, Chaffee, and White. He mentioned that Houston used the word gruesome to describe the tape recordings in a phone call to NASA headquarters. However, NASA officials would not admit that they knew about the tape evidence until after Wilford wrote a story in the New York Times on Tuesday, January 31st. This incident was symptomatic of the lack of candor which the public and Congress later found NASA to be guilty of. During the weekend of the fire, reporters constantly received vague and evasive replies to their questions, which made them remember Gemini 8. On Gemini 8, the capsule went out of control, and the communication tapes made during the crisis were withheld because NASA believed that the astronauts' voice level might have given a false impression of their behavior. They were later released, and assuming that they were complete, the astronauts had handled themselves with great control, providing that they were the original tapes, which we have no way of knowing. Reporters subsequently began to refer to the NASA initials as meaning, quote, never a straight answer, end quote. In the book entitled The Voyages of Apollo, The Exploration of the Moon, Richard Lewis explained what the situation was at Mission Control during Apollo 12. The following is a summary of his account. At midnight, the glass viewing room behind the mission control consoles was filled with VIPs, such as Administrator Payne, his deputy George M. Lowe, the astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Borman, C. Stark Draper, director of the Instrumentation Laboratory of MIT, where the Apollo Inertial Guidance System was developed, and Werner von Braun. However, not a single member of the news media was present. Newsmen had not been allowed in mission control since the policy was established in Project Mercury, supposedly to prevent uncontrolled disclosure in the event of a disaster. This continued until late in Apollo, when a press pool representative was finally admitted to the viewing chamber at the Johnson Space Center. In light of information presented on this broadcast so far, it seems much more than coincidental that such tight security measures were employed. Clearly, in lieu of the NASA charter, the public received carefully chosen information, some of which was true, and a great deal of which must have been totally fabricated based on the old concept of the moon's 1/6 gravity. And all the while, They should have been revealing the results of their research and the findings of the missions according to their charter and according to the law, without any censorship whatsoever. As the discrepancies encountered on the way to the moon become evident to those of you listening, it brings the spacecraft into lunar orbit. The next step is to consider the ramifications of a high lunar gravity on the fuel requirements of the lunar descent and ascent vehicles. And this, ladies and gentlemen, opens up a whole new chamber of horrors. To escape from the surface of a planet into space or to orbit around it, a space vehicle must be lifted to orbital height and be traveling a certain minimum speed. This requires energy to overcome the continuous pull of the gravitational field and to increase the vehicle's kinetic energy. You may recall, ladies and gentlemen, that the Apollo launch rocket, which sent men to the moon, stood 363 feet tall and weighed 6,400,000 pounds. A picture of the Apollo 11 rocket at launch can be found almost any place, to tell you the truth, and especially in all of the magazines that were published at the time. Anyone can obtain a photograph of the Apollo 11 rocket with little trouble. It was designed, ladies and gentlemen, to send a payload of approximately 100,000 pounds toward the moon at a velocity of 24,300 miles per hour. This is going to blow your minds, so you better strap yourself in your seat. The Apollo 4 rocket placed 278,699 pounds into the 110-mile-high circular orbit around the Earth. A much higher payload can be placed in orbit than can be sent to the moon because of the additional fuel and velocity needed to escape from the Earth. If the payload weight is divided into the total weight of the rocket, the payload ratio is determined. In the case of Apollo 4, this ratio equals 6,400,000 pounds divided by 278,699, or 23 to 1. This means that a launch weight of 23 times the payload was required to place the object into Earth orbit, and approximately 90% of the rocket's weight was fuel. If the moon had only 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, a much lower payload ratio than the above would have been needed by the lunar module to soft land or escape from the moon. NASA, of course, claimed that the lunar module, or LM as it was called, weighed 33,200 pounds when full of fuel. This comprised the ascent and descent stages. Since the loaded ascent stage weighed 10,600 pounds, and the empty descent stage weighed 4,500 pounds, the total payload for soft landing was 15,100 pounds. Therefore, the payload ratio for soft landing was 33,200 divided by 15,100, which comes out to 2.2 to 1. This loaded ascent stage supposedly weighed 10,600 pounds when full and 4,800 pounds when empty. The ascent payload ratio would then be 10,600 divided by 4,800, or 2.2 to 1. Also, the weights given, ladies and gentlemen, for the full and empty lunar module are consistent with the fuel requirements needed if the moon had only 1/6 gravity. Even the sizes of the tanks to hold the fuel are reasonable, hence the overall volume of the spacecraft fits the requirements for a low lunar gravity. But if the neutral point distance were 24,000 miles from the moon, then 1/6 gravity would be expected and the fuel requirements would have been met. The astronauts could have landed with the lunar module and taken off again, completing their moon exploration as planned. However, the 43,495-mile neutral point distance and its implication of a high lunar gravity remain. With the information that the moon's gravity must be at least 64% of Earth's, the lunar module fuel requirement was calculated, and this lunar gravity figure implies that the required payload ratio for landing and takeoff must be at least 7.2 to 1. The orbital velocity to be reached or braked is approximately twice what it would be under 1/6 gravity. And this requires about 4 times as much braking or ascent fuel. The additional fuel requirements under a high lunar gravity become horrendous. First, the ascent stage would have to weigh 7.2 times the empty weight, or 34,560 pounds. Second, the fuel required to soft land the fully loaded ascent stage would increase the lunar module's total weight to approximately 250,000 pounds. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the lunar module would be nearly as large as the Titan II rocket, which weighed 330,000 pounds and was 103 feet tall. Do you get the implications? The lunar module supposedly weighed 33,200 pounds. Hence, its weight and volume would have to increase by more than a factor of 7. The startling conclusion is that if men really landed on the moon in high lunar gravity conditions, it was not done with rockets. Again, you must be reminded that a 43,495-mile neutral point distance implies a lunar gravity equal to 64% of Earth's. A 64% lunar gravity, in turn, requires a large rocket just to escape from the moon, let alone soft land the takeoff rocket in the first place. The problem becomes astounding if the moon has a gravity equal to Earth's, and evidence will be presented which suggests that this may actually be the case. And if it were, the payload ratio would have to be 18 to 2, and this would require an 87,360-pound ascent stage alone. The descent rocket would weigh a staggering 1,589,000 pounds, 1/4 the size of the Saturn launch rocket. The Saturn launch vehicle would then need to weigh 64 times this, or 101,700,000 pounds. This is about 16 times larger than it actually was. So when I told you a long time ago that the figures did not support a moon landing, and you sent all those silly letters to me without doing any research on your own, simply because somebody told you that they went to the moon and you watched this little drama on television, and of course, you pulled the wool down over your eyes, sighed a little bit, and went back to sleep. And I disturbed your sleep, didn't I? I woke you up and began to make you think about it. And that bothered you. So without even checking, you began to write your letters. How silly. You see, these enigmas bring up some interesting questions. Why did the Russians apparently pull out of the space race when they were hot on the trail of putting a man on the moon and were way ahead of us, according to the newspapers and all of the scientists and all of the hoopla and all the propaganda and news releases? How did the United States succeed when rockets would clearly not work in the high lunar gravity conditions? What was the military's involvement in top-secret research that led to the successful moon landings? Well, I'll try to answer that, but not tomorrow night, because we have received a copy of the ADL report on the militias, and also a report issued to law enforcement officers across the country on the militias by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and for the next 2 nights, that's what I'm going to be reading to you, so you'll know what they're saying about us, and so that you can act accordingly. It is important that if you have a racially mixed militia, you must make that apparent to the public. If you have a religiously mixed militia, that also must be made equally apparent to the public, and we'll discuss this and other things over the next 2 nights. But understand this. It's not just the moon, ladies and gentlemen. We've been lied to about everything that we've ever thought was true. And Pooh, I'll I'll be home very shortly, baby, and I love you. And I love you too, Annie. And for the rest of you, good night, and God bless you all.